everybody. How you doing? Good. All right, so you've got, let's see, I think I have about an hour. Is that about right? Is that correct? Yes?
Sure, as long as you want.
Thank you, Casey. God bless you. All right. So I'm Lucy Arendt. I see a bunch of my students in the crowd. They were not incentivized in any way. They're here just because they love me. Is that right? No? Look at them nodding right now, going, yeah, exactly, Lucy, exactly. So I'm a professor of business at St. Norbert College. And just as Ryan and Chrissy did, let me tell you very briefly what got me interested in humor in the first place. In my PhD program, I decided that I wanted to study something that affected everyday people. And humor is something that I think most of us would agree we really don't want to live without. How many people would agree with that statement? Yeah, okay, I win. All right, good choice, right? So I'm going to talk not about the kind of humor that most people think of when they think of humor. I'm going to talk about dark humor. And when Ryan and I had a conversation, I think it was late summer, about what we might be talking about tonight, and he wanted to talk a little bit more about how humor, or how anger can be a positive, and I wanted to talk a little bit about this dark side of humor. So I'm going to try and answer a few questions for you. This is the framework for my presentation. What is dark humor? Do we need it? And then finally, can we imagine a world without dark humor? Now, caveat, I do not tell jokes. So, and I often get asked this because I do lots of presentations on humor, and people want to know, oh, are you going to tell jokes? No. Okay, I'm not, because I can't remember punchlines. But I will read some things to you that I hope will be funny. That said, because the topic is dark humor, you may not find everything funny. And that is to be expected. So what is it? Example. Two hunters are in the woods when one of them collapses. His hunting buddy immediately calls 911. My friend isn't breathing, he shouts into the phone. What should I do? Relax, the operator tells him. I can help. First, let's make sure he's dead. There's silence, and then a gunshot. The guy gets back on the phone and says, okay, now what? Oh, is that how we're going to start already? Okay, all right, fair. So what is dark humor? Cynical, gallows, black, or dark humor includes both morbid and farcical elements. It can appear inappropriate or illogical, and some would say it's a philosophical attitude, a way to maintain one's sanity under insane circumstances. Another example. We have no volume. It's not as good without the volume.
I'm still enjoying it.
Are you? God bless you. Wait for it. Oh! All right. So, whoopsies. Yeah. So allow me to summarize what just happened there. So it's the trunk monkey is your theft retrieval system, apparently. And as the person attempts to steal the car, the trunk monkey comes out of the trunk and takes care of the person who's trying to steal the automobile. A whole bunch of great commercials around the trunk monkey. All right. So I have two other videos that I'll also have to role play for you, but no worries, no problem, since apparently we don't have volume. So what does humor do? And this is generically what humor does for us, not just dark humor. It helps us to be happy. It helps us to be creative. It helps us by opening us to new ways of thinking. That's what humor does. In order for you to get the punchline to a joke, you have to be thinking differently. It helps us to understand our world. Humor helps us to create bonds and connections with each other. You know, when you and your best friends all get a joke, right? You're that much closer connected. It helps us to reinforce people's status. So some of us will find something very funny. We're part of the in group. Other people who don't find it so funny, part of the out group. It helps us to release nervous energy. We will laugh. How many folks have seen the most recent Joker movie? Yeah, a few people, you know that one of the issues that that character has is nervously laughing. Here we are. Humor helps us to deal with negative events and thoughts. It helps us to tell the truth as we perceive it. In fact, historically, court jesters, one of their key roles was to be able to tell royalty the truth, however difficult it might be, and then they could always say, "I'm just kidding," to protect themselves. It also helps us to address taboo topics. Example. My old aunts would come and tease me at weddings. "Well, Sarah, do you think you'll be next?" We settled this quickly once I started saying the same to them at funerals. More on what humor does. It helps us to manage relationships with family. It helps us to manage relationships with friends. It helps us to manage relationships with coworkers. Now, as I'm going through this list, think about your own experiences with this, right? For example, with your family, are there things that you laugh about together? With friends, are there specific things that you find funny? Maybe with coworkers. It helps us to manage relationships with bosses and people who report to us. It also helps us to manage relationships with customers. You know, what's key here is relationships, right? Humor helps us to manage relationships with all kinds of people. I'll let you read this. Some of you feel a little uncomfortable laughing, don't you? It's a terrific example of dark humor. Is this something that we need? What do you think? How many people think yes? Now, let's see the hands. This is the audience participation. There we go. Doesn't that feel good? All right. Do we need it? Well.
Hey, watch this. Hilarious.
Windex starts working even before you wipe for a superior streak-free shine.
Let's do it again.
Windex, a superior streak.
Terrible stuff. All right. Without dark humor, some thoughts that we have would be unmanageable. For example, negative emotions. Some topics might be unmanageable. All the isms, racism, sexism, ageism. When you think about stand-up comedians, for example, these are topics that they tackle, and they do so with humor. Some life events would be unmanageable. Illness, work, death, 9/11, Challenger explosion, war. I had a really interesting conversation with my oldest son about this. He serves in the US Navy, and he shared with me some examples of how folks in the military use dark humor. I'm not including any of that in this particular presentation because, as he said to me, civilians in general can't relate. These are folks who are having to deal with the worst of the worst, the possibility of dying on any given day, and in order to deal with that, they make fun of things that most of us would just not be able to laugh about. Some professions, again, leading off this last example, first responders, doctors, people in the military, without dark humor, it would be very difficult for them to go on. Do we have anybody in the audience who perceives that they're in a challenging profession, one where dark humor is really essential? They're out there. Right now they're running the ambulances and they're working in the surgical areas. They exist. Another example. I hate double standards. Burn a body at a crematorium, you're being a respectful friend. Do it at home and you're destroying evidence. Again, okay. Dark humor balances the negative, enabling us to manage life's challenges and do what we need to do to get through the day. Individuals use dark humor to vent their feelings, to elicit social support, and to distance themselves from a situation, ensuring that they can act effectively. Think about those professions that I mentioned, first responders, people who are doctors, surgeons, people in the military. In order for them to do what they need to do, humor helps them to cope with some pretty ugly reality. Another example. I was digging in our garden when I found a chest full of gold coins. No, not gonna work. Okay. I was about to run straight home to tell my wife about it, but then I remembered why I was digging in our garden. All right, now, I just want to tell you something, because I'm picking up on a vibe here in the crowd with respect to these examples. These are nothing, okay? If you go online and you look up dark humor examples, this is the lightest of the bunch. John would agree with this, right? My husband, as we were selecting choices, yeah, these are pretty light. So, a question you might ask yourself is, why not just use light humor that everyone likes? Right? Babies laughing, everybody likes that. That's a positive. Well, because only some people, in fact, are chosen to be our first responders, to heal the sick, to serve in the military. And these folks face illness, death, and frankly, the ugliest aspects of what it means to be human on a daily basis. Things that most of us just don't have to deal with. Dark humor helps them connect with each other and stay in the present. You can imagine how difficult it must be to be a first responder and to go home at night, tuck your children in bed, lie down next to your spouse, try to pretend like everything's okay after you've maybe had to deal with a horrific accident. This kind of shared humor enables them to live that life. Frankly, the darker the thought, the research says anyway, the darker the thought, the darker the experience, the profession, the darker the humor will be and needs to be. Doctor to a patient. I have good and bad news for you. Which one would you like to hear first? The good one, please. I found the diagnosis of your illness. It means you have 2 days to live. And the bad one? I've been trying to reach you for 2 days. So, can we imagine a world without dark humor? Is this something that we could foresee not needing? No. The answer is no. Why not? Because people will always suffer from ill health. People will always suffer the loss of their possessions. People will suffer the loss of friendships and family relationships. People will suffer the loss of employment. People will die. People will lose and be disappointed. And no matter what we do, we cannot stop bad things from happening. They are part of life. That's captioned as what old people do for fun, by the way. So, ergo, dark humor will always be a part of the human experience. We help ourselves, first by understanding dark humor's role and recognizing that some people need darker humor than we may personally like in order to deal with whatever darkness affects them. My grandfather says I'm too reliant on technology. They called him a hypocrite and unplugged his life support. Ouch. Ma'am, you accidentally left your child. Nope. All right. So, sorry about that. Key takeaways. Dark humor is pervasive. You're not sure about this? Go on Facebook, go on Twitter. Just look up dark humor, look up first responders, look up police officers, firefighters, you name it. You'll find lots and lots of examples. We need it to manage our lives and to help us feel whole. And the human experience is actually quite dark, and will therefore always include dark humor. Thank you.
Questions for Lucy? Everybody got jokes? There we go.
Yes.
One of the things that people are afraid of when they laugh at dark humor is that they are agreeing with the statement or that they're being heartless or cruel. And there are, to me, some topics that are, are too hurtful.
Okay.
Would you agree with that or not?
I think it depends on who you are. So I think for some people, a topic that I might find hurtful or you might find hurtful, someone in a different situation with a different context would maybe agree that they think it could be perceived as hurtful, but they would still find it funny because it would help them deal with some negative aspect of their life. I also think that oftentimes there's a lot of truth in things that we might call hurtful. And what I mean by that is not so much that the particular statement is true, but the fact that we are uncomfortable, for example, with racist humor, with sexist humor, blonde jokes, tells us something about our society. And people will still laugh at these things. So humor is a way that we can still have conversation around these topics in a way that is more comfortable for more people. And therefore, I would say it still needs to be happening. Yes?
I think that humor has always been wrapped up in our collective sense of morality.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, just look at Lenny.
Absolutely.
Bruce, it took a long time for comedians to be able to swear or, say certain things in their
Right.
acts.
George Carlin.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So, how do we not do that? How do we not, like you were just saying, if I want to joke about 9/11, and there's somebody in here who had a loved one or friend, who died on that day, or certainly we all we have strong feelings about that day in particular, but
Sure.
If I want to joke about that because that's my mental health release, it's not, it's just not acceptable, right? But how do we make it acceptable?
So, it's not acceptable maybe in some groups, in some crowds, in some situations, but in others it will be. Typically when we're, for example, with our closest friends, the pressure to conform to some expected morality may be lifted, and so we can say these things as a way of expressing, hey, this really bothers me. When I was a kid, we used to have, some of you in the room might remember the dead baby jokes. Anybody else remember? I see some, yeah. Like, what could be worse than that, right? And yet, when one is a particular age, it's hilarious. They're hilarious. And part of what those kinds of jokes help us to do is to face our own mortality, right? In a way that still feels kind of safe. Right, we're not having, as a 10-year-old, and I think I was 10, I don't know about the rest of you who remember doing these jokes, but I was like 10, so a kid, and therefore excusable. To talk about one's mortality at that age was overwhelming, right? But to be able to joke about dead babies, oh, okay, now we can laugh about this. So, some of this with dark humor is finding your crowd. And one of the things that I tell people is, look, if you don't like a particular comedian, don't watch that comedian. You don't like what you're seeing on a particular Facebook page or a Twitter feed, don't look at that. It's not for you. I think most of us, again, to go back to the military example, most of us would not be willing to look at some of the memes, for example, some of the videos, some of the jokes that are very common. My son shared with me, for example, suicide jokes are very common. Very common. Most of us would be appalled by that. But for folks in that situation, knowing that many of their brothers, their comrades, this is something that this is a way for them to deal with it. So I think we have to let that be. And just, if it doesn't work for you, you have choices. You don't need to scroll down that page. You don't need to go to that comedian. You don't need to click on that Netflix special.
More questions? Here we go.
Yes?
I'm wondering if this is a form of dark humor? Humor that's at someone else's expense? You know, can't you take a joke?
Yes.
That's just me.
So that kind of humor is intended to demonstrate our superiority to other people. And it's a way of being antagonistic, but then cloaking it in this, oh, can't you take a joke? I mean, where's your sense of humor? I suppose we could call that dark humor in one sense, but it's not really the gallows type of humor that necessarily helps people cope. That's just sort of a way of being mean. And being able to say, hey, you know what, if you had your act together, you would find it as funny as I do. Which, of course, why would the person find it funny when they're being attacked? I don't know if that gets at what you're asking, Nora. Yeah, cool. Sure.
How do you see sarcasm or self-deprecating type of humor relate to this? I mean, they're kind of coping mechanisms in humor also, aren't they?
Ish. So my students are like, she says ish all the time. Self-deprecating humor is great the first time, and it's funny. And the second time, and the third time, and the 50th time, it's fishing for compliments, and it reveals mostly insecurity. It's not really about gallows humor at that point. Sarcasm, depending on, people define this differently. There's having a dry wit, which some people would interpret as sarcasm, and then there's very aggressive type superiority-based humor, which is, again, that's attacking a person. The attacking a person doesn't really fit this mode. It's not really about adaptation. I think most people use the word sarcasm to mean different things. And when it's dry wit, that can absolutely fit into dark or gallows humor. When it's aggressive, that has a different intent behind it. It's meant to hurt people.
Any last questions? Okay, thank you very much, Lucy.
Sure.